The airplane speaker crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, we may experience slight turbulence ahead. A regular-looking man in seat 14A gripped the armrest tightly. Beside him, a sharply dressed CEO glanced over with a smirk. "You don't fly often, do you?" He smiled softly. "I used to," she laughed. "Who used to? What, crop duster?" He didn't answer. Minutes later, the captain's voice cut through the cabin, urgent and tense. "Control failure in cockpit. Is there any fighter pilot on board?" She turned, face drained of color. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Rowan, Echo 9, moving forward." Jack Rowan was 41 years old. He lived alone with his 8-year-old daughter, Mia. His hands were rough from years of maintenance work. His eyes, though, still carried the sharp focus of a fighter pilot. He wasn't flying for leisure today. He was heading to Nevada for a memorial service, a service for men who never made it home from the sky. On his wrist, an old military aviator watch, scratched, faded, a gift from his wingman, Marcus, who died saving their squadron 6 years ago. Jack didn't talk about those days much anymore. At gate 27, he waited quietly. His duffel bag sat between his feet. Inside, a folded flag and a handwritten letter from Mia. "Be brave, Daddy, like you taught me." Across the terminal, Victoria Hale moved like she owned the air itself. Tailored suit, diamond earrings. CEO of Aerotech Solutions, a company that built software for aviation systems. She had money, she had power, and she had no patience for people she considered beneath her. Her assistant trailed behind, juggling her coffee, laptop, and carry-on. "First class is already boarded, Ms. Hale," the assistant said nervously. "I know. I'm waiting for them to finish with the cattle and economy." She didn't lower her voice. Boarding began. Jack moved toward the gate. An elderly woman ahead of him struggled with her bag, trying to lift it into the overhead compartment. "Let me help you, ma'am," Jack said, stepping forward. He lifted it easily, settling it into place. "Thank you, young man," she said, her face lighting up. Behind him, Victoria sighed loudly. "Don't block the aisle, please. Some of us have places to be." Jack turned, nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am." He stepped aside and moved to his seat. Seat 14A, window. Victoria walked past, then stopped. She checked her boarding pass again, her expression soured. Seat 14B, right next to him. She sat down stiffly, keeping her designer purse on her lap like a barrier. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. Jack pulled out a small photo from his wallet. Mia grinning with missing front teeth, holding a toy plane. He smiled, tucked it back. "Touching?" Victoria muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. He didn't respond. The flight attendant came by, checking seatbelts. Victoria waved her over. "Excuse me, is there any chance I could switch seats? Maybe something in a quieter section?" The attendant glanced at Jack, then back. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're completely full today." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Of course." As the plane taxied, Jack stared out the window. The runway lights blurred past. His fingers traced the edge of his watch. He remembered the last time he flew, not as a passenger, as a pilot, in a cockpit that screamed through the clouds at twice the speed of sound. That life felt like another man's memory now. Victoria opened her laptop, typing aggressively. She muttered to herself, just loud enough. Some people should really just take the bus. Leave flying to those who can afford it. A few passengers nearby chuckled. Jack didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. From enemies. From allies. From himself. He closed his eyes. Breathed. Remembered what Marcus used to say. "Altitude doesn't make you better, Rowan. How you treat people at ground level does." The plane lifted off. And for a moment, Jack felt the pull of the sky again. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime. Victoria pulled out her tablet, scrolling through presentations. Her screen showed charts, profit margins, aircraft efficiency models. She made sure it was angled just enough for Jack to see. "Aerotech's Q3 numbers," she said to no one in particular. "We're revolutionizing aviation software, taking control systems to the next level." Jack nodded slightly, eyes still on the clouds below. She glanced at him. "You wouldn't understand. It's very technical." "I'm sure it is," he replied quietly. She smirked. What do you do? Let me guess. Middle management? Sales? Maintenance, Jack said. Her smile widened. Maintenance. Right. Well, someone has to do it, I suppose. A flight attendant walked by. Victoria flagged her down. Excuse me, do you have any champagne? I'd like to celebrate being in the air. Some of us actually enjoy flying. She shot a look at Jack. He said nothing. The attendant returned with a small bottle. Victoria took a sip, then spoke louder, clearly performing now. You know what I always say? Flying isn't for everyone. Some people are just meant to stay grounded. It's not about money, it's about belonging up here. A businessman across the aisle chuckled. Amen to that. Jack's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. His thumb rubbed the edge of his watch. Breathe. Let it go. Behind them, a young girl leaned forward between the seats. She was maybe 7, with curious eyes and a toy plane in her hand. Excuse me, mister, she said softly. Jack turned. Yes? Were you ever a pilot? She asked, holding up her toy. His face softened. Once upon a sky. The girl's eyes lit up. Really? Like a real plane? Yeah, a real one. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, how cute. Nostalgia's free at least. The girl's mother pulled her back gently. Sweetheart, don't bother the man. She's no bother, Jack said, smiling at the girl. You keep that plane safe, okay? It'll take you far. The girl beamed. Victoria muttered under her breath. Everyone's a hero in their own story. Jack finally looked at her, not with anger, just tired recognition. You're right, everyone is. She blinked, caught off guard by his calm. Minutes passed. The plane hummed steadily. Outside, the sun hit the wing at a perfect angle, casting light across the cabin. Then, without warning, the aircraft shuddered. Hard. Passengers gasped. Bags shifted in the overhead compartments. The plane dipped sharply to the left, then corrected. The seatbelt sign snapped back on. A loud ding echoed through the cabin. Victoria gripped her armrest. What was that? Jack's posture changed instantly. His head tilted, listening. His eyes tracked the wing outside, watching the flaps, the angle, the way the plane was compensating. Another jolt. Harder this time. A woman screamed. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, steady but strained. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a hydraulic failure. We're working to stabilize the aircraft. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Silence fell over the cabin like a weight. Then whispers. Panic rising like a tide. Victoria's face went pale. Her hands shook as she clutched her tablet. Hydraulic failure? What does that even mean? Jack didn't answer. He was already calculating. Altitude, speed, control surfaces, backup systems. The plane lurched again, nose dipping. A baby started crying. The businessman who'd laughed earlier was now white-knuckled, praying under his breath. Victoria turned to Jack, her arrogance cracking. Are we in danger? He met her eyes. Depends on what they can recover. Her breath hitched. The intercom clicked on again. This time the captain's voice was sharper, urgent. This is Captain Andrews. I need to make an unusual request. If there is anyone on board with military flight experience, specifically fighter or tactical aviation, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. I repeat, any military pilot, please come forward. The cabin erupted in murmurs. Victoria's eyes went wide. They're asking for a pilot? From the passengers? Her voice cracked. They're kidding, right? Jack unbuckled his seatbelt. She grabbed his arm. What are you doing? He stood, calm as stone. What I was trained to do. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. He reached up, pulled his duffel from the overhead, and unzipped it. Inside, beneath the folded flag, was an old flight jacket. Worn, faded. On the back, stitched in gold thread. Echo 9. He pulled it on. The flight attendant hurried down the aisle, eyes scanning frantically. She saw Jack standing, saw the jacket, and stopped dead. Sir, are you? Call sign Echo 9, Jack said quietly. F-22 Division, retired. Take me to the cockpit. Her face flooded with relief. Follow me, now. Victoria stared frozen. Jack looked down at her. No anger, no pride, just clarity. Stay calm. We'll get through this. Then he turned and walked toward the front of the plane. Every eye in the cabin followed him. The little girl behind them whispered, "Mommy, is he a hero?" Her mother, tears in her eyes, nodded. "I think he is, baby." Victoria sat back, hands trembling, staring at the empty seat beside her. For the first time in years, she had no words. The cockpit door opened. Captain Andrews turned, face drawn with stress. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Beside him, the co-pilot frantically cycled through backup systems, hands moving across switches and dials. "You the pilot?" Andrews asked, hope and desperation mixing in his voice. Jack stepped inside. "Jack Rowan, call sign Echo 9, F-22 Raptor Division, retired 3 years ago." The captain's eyes widened. "Echo 9? You're in the system. You're actually in the database." "I am." Andrews exhaled shakily. "Thank God. We've lost primary hydraulics, secondaries failing, the stick's barely responding. We're flying on prayers and backup electrical trim." Jack moved to the center console, eyes scanning the instruments with surgical precision. Airspeed, altitude, vertical speed indicator, artificial horizon tilted 7 degrees left. His hands didn't shake. His breathing didn't change. This was muscle memory. This was home. "Show me what you've got," Jack said. The co-pilot gestured to the panel. "Hydraulic pressure's at 15% and dropping. We tried manual reversion, but the yoke's too stiff. We can't maintain level flight. If we lose the last system, we lose all control surfaces." Jack studied the panel. His mind shifted into combat mode. Calculate, prioritize, execute. "Altitude?" he asked. 32,000 feet. "Distance to nearest airport?" 70 miles, Denver International. Jack nodded. "That's workable. What's your fuel state?" 40 minutes at current burn rate. "More than enough." Jack crouched slightly, checking the flight management system. "Have you tried isolating the hydraulic loops? Route everything to the flight control actuators?" Andrews blinked. We didn't think of that." "Do it now. Co-pilot, dial back thrust to 85%. We need to reduce stress on the airframe." The co-pilot hesitated. "Sir, I don't—" "Do it," Jack said firmly. Not harsh, just absolute. The co-pilot obeyed. Jack's hands moved across the controls like a pianist playing from memory. Reroute hydraulic pressure, bypass the secondary valve, feed everything into elevator and aileron control. Forget the rudder for now. We'll fly her with wings and trim. Andrews watched, mesmerized. You're actually doing this." Jack didn't respond. He was already 3 steps ahead, running failure scenarios in his mind. "If this doesn't work, we do this. If that fails, we go here." He toggled the intercom. "Captain, may I?" Andrews nodded. Jack pressed the button. His voice filled the cabin. Calm, steady, unshakable. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jack Rowan speaking from the cockpit. We're working through a technical issue, but I want you to know we have full control of this aircraft. We'll be making a priority landing in Denver shortly. Stay seated, stay calm. We've got you." In the cabin, passengers sat in stunned silence. Victoria stared at the speaker above her head, her mouth slightly open. That voice, that same man she'd mocked, that same man she'd looked down on. The little girl whispered, "He sounds like a superhero." Her mother squeezed her hand. "He is, baby." Back in the cockpit, Jack turned to Andrews. "I'm going to need you to trust me. I'm going to manually override the flight computer. It's going to feel wrong. The plane's going to resist. But if we let the computer keep trying to autocorrect, it'll burn out what hydraulics we have left." Andrews swallowed hard. "You're asking me to turn off the autopilot entirely?" "I'm telling you to let me fly this bird the way I was trained. Old school, by hand, by feel." The co-pilot looked terrified. "Sir, commercial pilots don't train for this. This is what fighter pilots do every day," Jack interrupted. "We fly broken planes home. It's what we're built for." He locked eyes with Andrews. "Do you trust me, Captain?" Andrews stared at him, at the calm, at the certainty, At the gold stitching on the jacket that read Echo 9. He nodded. Yeah, I do. Good, then switch to manual. Full authority. Andrews flipped the override. The plane shuddered. Alarms beeped. The autopilot disengaged with a loud click. Jack gripped the yoke. And just like that, he was back. Not in a commercial jet, not in a cockpit full of civilians, but in the sky, where he belonged, where the physics were the same, where instinct replaced thought. He pulled gently. The nose lifted 2 degrees. Too much. He eased off, found the balance. The plane steadied. Trim nose down, 0.5, Jack said. Co-pilot, adjust throttle. Match my rhythm. The co-pilot obeyed, hands moving in sync with Jack's. Outside, the wings flexed. The plane carved through the air, unstable but alive. Jack's voice was almost meditative. Easy, easy. Don't fight her. Let her breathe. She wants to fly. We just have to guide her. Andrews watched in awe. You're flying a 200-ton jet like it's a fighter. Jack's lips curved slightly. Same rules, just slower. Minutes passed. The plane descended smoothly. Jack adjusted trim, power, angle. Every movement minimal. Precise. The co-pilot exhaled. Hydraulics are holding at 10%. It's working. Denver Control, this is Flight 447, Andrews radioed. We have a qualified military pilot assisting, requesting priority landing clearance. Full emergency services on standby. Roger, 447. You're cleared direct. Runway 34 right. Wind is calm. Fire trucks are rolling. Jack's eyes never left the horizon. Flaps? Flaps are hydraulic, the co-pilot said nervously. We might not have enough pressure. We'll land without them. Increase approach speed by 20 knots. Tell the cabin to brace. Andrews nodded and keyed the intercom. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. Brace position on my signal. The city appeared ahead, lights spreading across the ground like a galaxy. Jack aligned the plane with the runway. His hands moved with impossible calm. Gear down. The co-pilot hit the switch. A clunk. 3 green lights. Gear down and locked. Jack descended. 1,000 feet. 500. 200. The runway rushed up. Brace, Andrews said into the intercom. Jack pulled back slightly. The plane's wheels kissed the pavement. A small bounce, then solid contact. He reversed thrust. The plane slowed. Smooth. Controlled. Perfect. The aircraft rolled to a stop on the taxiway. For a moment, no one in the cockpit spoke. Then Andrews laughed, a sound of pure relief. You just saved 200 lives. Jack released the yoke. His hands were steady. No, Captain, we all did. He stood, removed the headset, and turned toward the door. Andrews grabbed his hand. I don't know how to thank you. Jack shook his hand firmly. You already did. You trusted me. Tell me. He stepped out of the cockpit and back into the cabin. And that's when the applause began. The applause started slow. One person, then another. Then the entire cabin erupted. Jack walked down the aisle and people stood. Strangers reached out to touch his shoulder, to shake his hand. Some were crying. Thank you, a man said, voice breaking. My daughter's getting married next week. I get to walk her down the aisle because of you. An elderly woman grabbed his hand with both of hers. Bless you, son. Bless you. Jack nodded to each of them, humble. Uncomfortable with the attention, but gracious nonetheless. He reached row 14. Victoria stood, frozen. Her designer purse hung loosely in her hand. Her carefully composed expression had crumbled completely. Their eyes met. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I need to apologize. Jack stopped. I was cruel, she continued, voice shaking. I judged you. I mocked you. And you saved all of us. He studied her for a moment. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with understanding. You don't owe me anything, Jack said quietly. But maybe next time you fly, remember something. What's that? You never know who's sitting next to you. or what they've been through, or what they're capable of. He paused. Fly kinder. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak. Jack moved past her. The little girl from earlier broke free from her mother and ran up to him. In her hands, a piece of paper. She'd drawn a picture during the crisis. A plane, a stick figure with wings, and words in crayon. Hero Dad. She held it up to him, beaming. This is you. Jack knelt down, eye level with her. His throat tightened. For a moment he saw Mia, saw his daughter's face, felt the weight of why he did what he did. He took the drawing carefully. This is the best thing anyone's ever given me. Thank you. She hugged him, quick, tight, then ran back to her mother. Jack stood, holding the paper like it was made of gold. He folded it gently and tucked it into his jacket pocket, right over his heart. As passengers filed off the plane, many stopped to thank him again. Some asked for photos. Others just wanted to shake his hand one more time. Jack obliged them all. Patient, kind, present. The businessman who'd laughed earlier approached, sheepish. Hey man, I just wanted to say, I was a jerk back there, laughing at her comments. That wasn't right. Jack nodded. We all have moments we're not proud of. What matters is what we do next. The man shook his hand firmly. You're a better man than most. Finally, the cabin emptied. Jack walked to the exit. Captain Andrews and the co-pilot stood waiting by the door. Andrews extended his hand. The airline's going to want to talk to you. Media too, probably. You're a hero, Mr. Rowan. Jack shook his head. I'm not a hero, Captain. I just did what I was trained to do. That's exactly what makes you one, Andrews said. Heroes don't think about it. They just act. Jack smiled faintly. Then I guess I'm in good company. You kept that plane together long enough for me to help. That took courage, too. He stepped off the plane and into the jetway. Behind him, the crew stood in silence, watching him disappear into the crowd. Just another passenger, just another face, but they knew better. 1 week later, the memorial service was held at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Rows of white chairs faced a stage with photographs of fallen pilots. The sky above was sharp blue, endless. Jack stood at the podium, his dress uniform crisp and clean. On his chest, medals he rarely wore. Behind him, the F-22 squadron insignia hung on a banner. He looked out at the crowd, families, fellow veterans, active duty pilots, people who understood what it meant to serve. And there in the back row, a face he didn't expect. Victoria Hale. She wore simple clothing, no designer labels, no jewelry. She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, listening. Jack began to speak. Heroes aren't the ones with medals, he said, his voice steady. They're not the ones with their names in the headlines or their faces on TV. Heroes are the ones who never stop serving, even when the uniform comes off, even when the world forgets, even when no one's watching. He paused, emotion creeping into his voice. My wingman, Marcus Chen, used to say that the sky doesn't measure you by your rank. It measures you by your heart, by whether you show up when it matters, by whether you lift others up, even when you're falling yourself. A few people wiped their eyes. Marcus didn't die for glory. He died so his squadron could live, so their families could see them again, so the mission could be completed. Jack's voice wavered. That's what service means. Putting others first, always. He stepped back from the podium. The crowd rose in applause. Soft at first, then building. A standing ovation that echoed across the airfield. After the ceremony, Victoria approached. She held an envelope. Mr. Rowan, she said, may I have a moment? Jack turned surprised. Ms. Hale, she handed him the envelope. Aerotech would like to offer you a position, not as a consultant, not as a figurehead, as a pilot trainer, teaching our engineers what real flying looks like, what real leadership looks like. She paused. No titles, no pride, just purpose. Jack opened the envelope. Inside, a contract and a handwritten note, because the world needs more people like you. He looked at her, really looked, and saw someone different than the woman on the plane, someone humbled, Someone changed. He smiled. Purpose never left. It just changed altitude. Victoria smiled back, tears in her eyes. Thank you for teaching me that. She walked away, leaving Jack standing beneath the open sky. He pulled out the drawing from the little girl, unfolded it, looked at the stick figure with wings. A voice his own echoed in his mind. They say the sky forgets no name. Maybe that's why, even in silence, the wings still find me. Above him, an F-22 screamed across the sky, trailing golden light in the sunset. Jack watched it disappear into the horizon and smiled. Subscribe if you believe honor never retires. It just waits for the next call.